Good evening. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. We're now in our 11th year, which means we've handed out 44, almost 48 now, fellowships at $72,000 a pop. And our fellows are hardworking biographers, and they've actually published almost 20 books so far. We're also, I want to make a little announcement, a plug for our new 2-year master's degree program in memoir and biography, which we're now recruiting the first class for, which will begin in September. And it's not too late to apply if any of you are working on a memoir or a biography and want to learn the art and craft. Finally, we have some upcoming events on a really diverse biographical range of topics, from Nelson Algren on May 8th to Mel Brooks on May 7th, Kurt Cobain on May 28th, and Andrew Johnson on June 3rd. Ooh. So a little culture, a little music, a little history. But tonight we are honored to have two leading historians of the Civil War era, David Blight of Yale University and our own James Oakes, a professor here at the Graduate Center, to discuss Blight's acclaimed new biography of Frederick Douglass. They will have a conversation for about 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A. And afterwards, I think David has agreed to sign books at the back in the lobby. 13 years ago, on this very day at 3 p.m., I was sitting at home, unemployed, wondering what my next book would be, when the phone rang, and I was told that I had won a Pulitzer Prize. Well, I immediately called my wife, who didn't believe me. She hung up the phone and ran to the computer and checked it on the web, and then she called back and she said she believed me. A few days later, my mentor, the famous editor Victor Navasky, the editor of The Nation magazine, explained that winning a Pulitzer changes your life. Well, he was right. It has opened the door to many new adventures. Anyway, today at 3 p.m., our own David Blight here was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in History. He won the prize in the history category, although his book is, I think, really a biography.
I thought so.
Anyway, David, my heartfelt congratulations on your own new great adventure. And now I turn the floor over to Jim.
Thank you. Well, this is a very special evening for me for a number of reasons, one of which is that David is a good friend, but also because David travels so often that it's almost impossible to get him to sit down and have a talk for more than 5 minutes. So this is 40 minutes that I rarely get to spend with David, and I'm really pleased with this. This, for those of you who don't know much about Frederick Douglass scholarship, this is a book that I wondered 15 years ago why it hadn't been written, that there were magnificent multi-volume biographies of Du Bois and multi-volume biography of Booker T. Washington, and nothing like it. Nothing like it for Frederick Douglass. Good biographies, but...
Your book.
Good biographies, but... but not this kind of book. And this is a book I have been waiting for and wondering why it hadn't been done, and it's been done by the perfect person, the best person I could imagine doing it. So I'm really pleased with it. It's a marvelous book. It well deserves the prizes. Let me start the conversation by pointing out, for those of you who don't know, that David's first book, right, was called Frederick Douglass's Civil War. And when I was doing my Frederick Douglass book, aside from the fact that there was no decent, well, they were good, but no definitive biography I could rely on, there were two books that I really thought stood out. And one of them was by a guy named Dixon Preston,
right,
on young Frederick Douglass, a journalist who dug up all sorts of things like when Frederick Douglass was born.
Right.
And the other was your first book. And the reason I thought your first book was so admirable,
You kept it in print, I think.
I only bought
3 people were teaching it.
Well, I'm glad if I did. The reason I liked it so much is because it was admiring of Douglass, but it was also, I don't want to say warts and all, I would say flaws and all. And this is the same way, this biography. And so at the very beginning of your career, you were engaged with Frederick Douglass, and now, I don't want to say the end of your career, but at the other end, toward the other end of your career.
I'm going fishing now.
You're back to Frederick Douglass. Well, you're going to make enough money to go fishing, I think. And you should. You deserve it. Now you've lost my train of thought.
I'm sorry. I shouldn't interrupt you.
I guess my first question then is, it's been a long time since you've been with Frederick Douglass for a very long time. And what has changed, if anything, over the years? What did writing this book change in the way you thought about Frederick?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. Thank you, Kai, for inviting me to do this. God, thank you all for coming. And I'll go anywhere to talk to Jim, whether it's in public or not, maybe especially in not. But Jim is one of my favorite historians ever. I'll just get that out of the way. And the book on Douglass and Lincoln, still the best treatment of the political ideologies of those two men. I did a dissertation that was on Douglass. It was this sort of small treatment of the meaning of the Civil War in Douglass's life and thought. And it was essentially intellectual history, I thought, and by no means an attempt at biography in the full sense. I then did editions of his first 2 autobiographies over the years. I wrote essays on Douglass. I edited and put out an edition of the Columbian Orator, which is the wonderful, to Douglass, magical book he discovered as a 12-year-old. But I had Douglass completely out of my life until I encountered a private collection that made this book possible and necessary about 12 years ago. What's changed is so many things. And they've especially changed because of modern scholarship on Douglass. My dissertation came published as a book in 1989. Bill McFeely's biography of Douglass, I think, was 90 or 91. And then there have been this series of Douglass and Lincoln books. Douglass has been discovered, as you know, by political theorists. There are at least 3 books on Douglass as a political thinker. There are whole collections of essays on Douglass by law school professors who have discovered. Literary critics have been on Douglass ever since the 1970s. And whole collections of those, too. So, you know, I learned so much more from all the other scholarship. But it was this new private collection of Douglass material. If you've cracked the book at all, you know about it because it's right in the preface. I went to Savannah, Georgia, 12 years ago to give a talk on Douglass's narrative, his first autobiography. I've done this many times. And my host there, the Georgia Historical Society, said there's a local collector here. He'd like to meet and have lunch. And my reaction was something like, yeah, I guess so. And that day I met the amazing, incredible Walter Evans, an African-American retired surgeon who grew up in Savannah, segregated Savannah, went north for his higher education, Michigan Medical School, practiced in Detroit for 30 or 35 years, but his real passion for decades has been collecting African-American art, manuscripts, and rare books. And that day he took me over, and this changed everything. He took me over to his house, his beautiful 4-story brownstone, and got out portions of his Douglass collection on his dining room table. So to the question, what changed is that collection, the core of that collection, are about 10 very large Douglass family scrapbooks. which were kept by Douglas's sons over the last 30 to 35 years of their father's life, with devotion. It's thousands of newspaper clippings. It's quite a good collection of family letters and photographs, and even all kinds of other family documents. But what it opened up was the older Douglas, the last third of Douglas's life, the post-Civil War Douglas. Not, if Americans know Douglas at all, and even our students who come to us, many have already read the narrative, the first autobiography. Although I just gave a talk over at Goldman Sachs this afternoon for their employees on this, and my moderator asked for a show of hands of who had read the narrative, and there wasn't very many people. So I don't do it here, because here it'll be almost everybody, of course. But if Americans know Douglas, they know the young Douglas, the heroic Douglas, the escaped slave who remakes himself, becomes a great orator, has some role in the Civil War, but that older Douglas who seemingly becomes this patriarch and this bureaucrat and this insider, turns out took over the book for me in some ways because of that collection and because he is so fascinating in this, I was going to say in this role, in the last third of his life. It's a complex story of the old radical outsider, which is the theme you developed, who becomes this political insider or wants to be this political insider and does indeed become a government bureaucrat and grows into this role of spokesman of his race and everything that goes with that, which means the next generation of black leaders, almost all of whom are college educated, northern born, unlike Mr. D, who was born a slave with no education. They want to knock him off. And that last third of his life becomes this complicated story of it's really quite a modern story in some ways. He's the prototype, really, of this phenomenon of the old radical who becomes an insider and then has to live with what that means, the kinds of compromises or deals and of the sort that anyone like that makes. So a lot of things changed for me because a whole lot of new sources were available. And also, you just grow as a scholar. I mean, I was stupid when I wrote that first book.
Well, I could see the first book in here. I mean,
yeah, well, I rewrote those chapters, but a lot of it's still there. It's true.
But let's go through that arc of his life from
Sure.
From the radical outsider to the political insider. What are the various stages for which he makes that transition?
Sure. Well, he escapes from slavery when he's only 20. He's hardly fully formed as anything, orator or writer, but soon becomes this itinerant orator and takes the abolitionist circuit by storm with his, frankly, quite amazing storytelling about slavery. That first stage of his public career is really the 1840s to the late 1840s. When he's a Garrisonian, he's a devoted follower of William Lloyd Garrison and moral suasion and anti-politics, which he overcomes. And the idea that Garrison's idea, he towed the line for about 6 years, that the Constitution was a covenant with the devil and could not be used against slavery, and also Garrison's very, very stern pacifism, non-resistance. But Douglas grows enormously when he goes to England in 1845 to 47, about 18 months. An amazing flowering for a young man who's only 27 and 28 years old. He's just out of slavery for 8 years, and he's got this narrative in his hand, his 130-page autobiography that he can hardly keep in print. In fact, he has a new edition published in Ireland, 2 new editions published in Ireland, so he could keep the damn thing in print. And everywhere he goes, he's treated like the most exotic, fascinating character they've ever seen. They loved him in Ireland. They loved him even more in Scotland. God, they wrote poems and songs about him in Scotland. And in England, he meets everybody in the British reform world. And some of them raise the money to buy his own freedom. So he comes back to the U.S., and then this big
But
transition.
the Garrisonians are
Oh.
very suspicious.
Very suspicious, and they're monitoring him, even spying on him. Garrison had Maria Weston Chapman back in Boston. You know, hey, every major reform movement in history has at times turned on itself. What do reformers do? They argue with each other. What does the Democratic Party do? It fights with itself. I mean, that's what ends up happening. Sometimes they're ideological schisms, and sometimes they're personality wars. This was a young, dynamic, black orator of enormous skill. And also now he's a writer, and he's just not to be controlled. And that doesn't mean that he was always on the higher ground about some of these things. Douglass was hypersensitive. If he thought somebody was monitoring him or suggesting he not say what he wants to say, he sometimes blistered them, and sometimes he got the wrong person and made a lot of enemies. But anyway, he's eager to grow out of this kind of almost straitjacket that the Garrisonians wanted him in. And that image is not always fair to the Garrisonians entirely, but...
You're pretty rough on them.
Well, I am rough. But when he comes back to the U.S. in 1847, he moves from Lynn, Massachusetts, the Boston area, out to western New York, Rochester, New York, known as a Quaker city, or a lot of Quakers lived there, and an anti-slavery city. You know, it was out at the terminus of the Erie Canal. It was a burgeoning, growing city, and hence safe, too. He chose it for safety for his family. But Douglass founds his own newspaper, the North Star, and he did it with money given to him by his British friends. In fact, without his British patrons, he and his family don't survive. His paper would never have survived.
Not free.
Sorry?
Wouldn't have been freed.
He wouldn't have been freed. And he wouldn't return to the U.S. without the free paper in his hands. And now he's this 28, 29, 30-year-old, full of the experience of being treated like an intellectual, like the most amazing thing they'd ever seen around, all over the British Isles, and experiencing very little racism, and some, but nothing like what he experienced here. And he comes back to the U.S., this very angry young man, denouncing the United States in sometimes vicious terms. In fact, Wendell Phillips, great abolitionist, took him aside one day and said, "Fred, can you tone it down? I mean, come on, you're going to lose the audience. You got to stop just attacking the United States." And Douglass said, "No, I won't. I have no country," which became a refrain in his speeches. Stages. Well, now he grows into, somewhat quickly, although it takes time, the political abolitionist that he becomes in the 1850s, under the influence of new mentors like Gerrit Smith, a great philanthropist abolitionist of upstate New York, Peterborough, New York.
The Free Soilers.
And the Free Soilers. He speaks at the 1848 Free Soil Convention. He joins the Liberty Party, which was anathema to the Garrisonians. You were supposed to not get your hands dirty in politics, because politics was inherently corrupt and so on and so forth. Douglass is learning now a kind of, it's one of the most interesting things about him. You dealt with this brilliantly. He's learning a kind of political pragmatism that's necessary to get anywhere in a republic. He hates it at times. He's got to now make compromises in his own mind with people he doesn't like. But he warms up to the politics of anti-slavery, and events make him do it. The Fugitive Slave Act, the Fugitive Slave Rescues, Kansas-Nebraska Act, and all of these great issues, from the Mexican War, Fugitive Slave Act, Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, all of these, and violence. Dred Scott, for sure. In that segment of less than a decade, he's got his own newspaper now. It's a weekly, and he learns the short form political editorial. Douglass was a great journalist. We don't always think of him that way. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of these blistering short form editorials that became his kind of trademark. And if you go look up a list of Frederick Douglass quotations, many of them are from those editorials. And by the middle of the 1850s, he's now trying to figure out how to shoulder up to the Republican Party. Here's this new party, this strange coalition now. It's come into existence because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the expansion question. They're not all, moral abolitionists. They're not radicals, all of them. But by God, there's now a political party that is putting tremendous pressure on slavery, on the slave system. And he can begin to see is really bothering the South. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And through the course of the 1850s, he has this roller coaster ride where he supports the Republicans in presidential election years, and then in off-year elections, he goes back to the Radical Abolition Party, or Garrett Smith and the Liberty Party, if it still exists. He gives his vote to radical abolition in the off years, but in presidential years, so far as we can tell, he goes Republican, although not always, without his fingers on his nose. But it's the radical learning a pragmatic sense of politics and learning that American political institutions themselves will have to be the place where slavery gets destroyed somehow, otherwise there's no alternative but violent revolution. Right. And former slaves knew that slave insurrection was never a good idea, because all the dead people would be black people, So, and then comes the Civil War, but we could take that up.
I hadn't realized how deeply engaged in the secession crisis he was. He was so afraid of another compromise. They compromised at the Constitution Convention. They compromised in 1820. They compromised again in 1850.
He just assumed that's how it was going to end.
And so he's like, no compromise, no compromise.
And he's outside of power then. That's the outsider. Because, when Lincoln gets elected, which Douglas supported, although it was a very disappointing election for him in one sense, because he led the campaign in the state of New York to get rid of the $250 property requirement for black men to vote in the state of New York. He and James McCune Smith led that referendum. In fact, published a manifesto he campaigned all over New York. That went down by like 70%, even though Lincoln wins New York.
Right.
So he had to deal, on the one hand, a lot of New Yorkers voted for Lincoln, but also voted against getting rid of the property requirement only for blacks, not for whites. It was disappointing. But he was glad Lincoln wins. However, when secession follows, it's on the one hand his fondest dream. Like, come on. Because Douglas, not that he had any of this, he wasn't the prophet who always predicted accurately. In fact, that's not what a prophet does. We can come back to what a prophet is, but he wanted some breakup, some kind of sanctioned conflict between North and South, between slavery and freedom. That was his fondest hope. He had no clear idea how it was to happen, but this election seemed to be making it happen. Right. So he applauded secession. He kept saying, let the conflict come. Right. We have waited too long. However, a mob attacked him in Faneuil Hall, Tremont Temple in Boston in December of 1860, which was the first anniversary of the hanging of John Brown. A vicious mob attacked this abolitionist commemoration. Abolitionists were being blamed for the crisis of the Union, and he actually got scared. He thought, well, not scared, but he believed that this crisis now would somehow be compromised. Of course, there were all kinds of compromise efforts and attempts. There were any number of compromise ideas floated throughout the winter of secession.
Well, he still didn't trust the Republican Party. And as a result, I think he pretty much consistently misread what Lincoln and the Republicans were up to.
I think you're right. He either misread or he just didn't know. Because he's not inside any Republican circles yet. He's not he's out in Rochester, New York, publishing his newspaper. In fact, reading his newspaper through the secession crisis is fascinating. You see this fear, this joy and fear. Oh, and
So he continues that way pretty much
Right down to
through
the-
the war, through most of the war. He
Well-
has these 3 meetings with Lincoln, but he goes up and down about Lincoln, right? And I get the
At least
sense,
the first 2 years of the war. He's supporting Lincoln in 63 and 4.
although he goes up and down, he's
He's
still going up and down. I get the sense from your book anyway that it's the real turning point isn't so much the Emancipation Proclamation, though he's thrilled by it.
Yeah,
It's the 3rd meeting,
right.
the second meeting.
Second
excuse me,
meeting.
The second
Second
meeting. Douglas meets with Lincoln 3 times, and this is the second meeting in August of '64, and he realizes how committed to the abolition of slavery Lincoln is. And then he goes and hears the second inaugural address, and
he
he's
wishes he'd
blown
written
away.
that speech for Lincoln, but he's thrilled that Lincoln wrote it.
Right.
That was the important.
Because had all the religious
Absolutely.
symbolism of,
It was a
of
Douglasonian
divine
speech.
retribution. The war is divine retribution for slavery.
That 3rd paragraph of the second inaugural is not only the greatest paragraph in any presidential speech, it's Douglas's vision of the war.
And from that point on, I think he's a Republican.
Oh, no question. In fact, at that
We have a
meeting,
different set of problems. Instead of being the outsider,
oh yeah,
which has advantages and disadvantages,
Oh, yeah.
now he's the committed Republican.
right.
With
And in
its
that
advantage.
1864 election, well, first of all, at this August 1864 meeting, which Jim brought up, a little detail there. If you know your Civil War at all, you know this is during the horrible stalemate of the summer of 1864. Horrible stalemate in Virginia. Siege of Petersburg. Horrible stalemate around Atlanta and Georgia. Sherman's been trying to take Atlanta for weeks on end. Stalemates all over the place. Farragut hasn't yet taken Mobile Bay, the greatest naval battle of the war, and a huge turning point. Lincoln believes he may not be reelected. In fact, there's every reason to believe he would not be reelected.
His own party was telling him to withdraw.
His own party was saying this isn't going to happen. The Democrats are going to win, which means George McClellan, which we don't know for sure what would have happened, but the Democrats would have had probably some negotiated peace.
No 13th Amendment.
And no 13th Amendment. And the Republican Party by then is already on record as supporting the 13th Amendment, which had passed one house of Congress back in the winter of '64, but not the other. And what did the Democrats do to the Republicans that year? Same thing that parties always do. They just stamped them on the head as the party of emancipation
And racial equality.
and racial equality, and used every N-word, nasty kind of illustration they could think of to portray the Republic. They called Lincoln Abraham Africanus the First, claiming that he was really black, and on and on and on, and worse than that. Well, invites Douglas to the White House. The first time Douglas met Lincoln at the White House, he just went and got in line and said, "Let me in." This time he's invited, because Lincoln wanted, first of all, I want to know Douglas's opinion of what he should do about this election. But most importantly, Lincoln looked Douglas in the eye and asked him to be the principal agent of a scheme that would funnel as many slaves out of the Upper South as possible before Election Day, in case Lincoln did not win re-election, such that as many as possible would be behind Union lines and under some kind of legal freedom if he gets defeated. And I'm convinced, Douglas sort of said this, but not as explicitly as I do. I'm convinced he was stunned.
Douglas.
Douglas.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he
Absolutely.
basically said, sure. He had no clue how he was supposed to do it. All he was told was, the War Department will organize it. Douglas goes home to Rochester, starts telegraphing and writing to all kinds of people. He had a whole group beginning to line up to be the agents of this system, and then he's, of course, saved by the fall of Atlanta, the fall of Mobile Bay, Sheridan's success in the Shenandoah Valley, and Northern morale made a huge shift because of the success of the war. And then Douglas dearly wanted to campaign for Lincoln, and the Republicans wouldn't let him.
Right.
Because they're trying now to, skirt around the emancipation issue as much as, don't want to have to talk about that as much. Seward, the Secretary of State, even said publicly, well, maybe emancipation won't happen, it'll be settled in the courts, whatever that was supposed to mean. Douglas was angry that they wouldn't let him go on the stump. But when Lincoln was reelected, boy, did he go on the stump with a couple of the most amazing speeches he ever gave, both in Rochester and then in Baltimore and many other places. Because then you could see the war is going to be prosecuted now to the destruction of slavery and whatever is to come. By then, he and Lincoln, by the time of the second inaugural, he and Lincoln are almost on the same script.
Right.
Which is an amazing change when you realize where they had been 2 and 3 years ago.
So the standard story about the Republican Party after Reconstruction is that, well, even before the end of Reconstruction, is losing its idealism about slavery and equal rights.
Yeah.
It's becoming the party of the bankers in the Gilded Age and the age of corruption. And Douglas stays with it.
He does.
He's critical of where it's going,
Right.
but he stays with it. And this is what creates so much problems for historians analyzing him.
Right.
Most historians don't like what Douglas
No.
did. You
Love
and
to
I
be-
are easier on him for that because it's a difficult choice. But
Yeah. The Republican Party is the ship, all else is the sea. That was one of his lines about the Republican Party. He's very critical of the Republicans by the 1880s into the early 90s.
I
On
think
the
it's
other
the
hand,
Democrats.
Pardon me?
I think he saw what the Democrats.
the
The
Democrat-
alternative is the Democrats, and they're
Exactly.
absolutely
and he called them pro-slavery.
absolutely horrible.
He said they're no different. This is a pro-slavery political party in the 1880s.
And so long as that's the alternative,
Exactly. It's the two-party system we know so well. I mean, we don't need to go into that parallel, do we?
right? That's why we're all Democrats.
That's right. That's right. Well, where are we? Manhattan. I guess that's right. We're in
Right.
Manhattan.
So one-party state.
But it is difficult, and he takes a lot of heat for it, especially from other black leaders, the younger black leaders who say, wait a minute, Mr. D, you're falling out of touch. You know, these people don't care about us, at least after Reconstruction, well, even at the end of Reconstruction. But he campaigned out on the stump for every Republican presidential candidate from Grant to the end, from Grant through Harrison, his last. So from 68 through 1892, and they would send him to certain states. Right. I mean, he was hired to do this.
Right.
And boy, was he a campaign stump speaker. There's even a cartoon I have in the book that shows Douglas. It was in Puck. It was in that magazine called Puck. It shows Douglas standing on a tree stump with his big white mane of hair, waving to a crowd, stump speaking. In Indiana. Indiana was a swing state in the late 19th century. They always sent him there. I don't know why. But you know what he always argued? He kept demanding that the Republican Party remain what it had once been.
Right.
And it's easy for us to forget, but a lot of Democrats old enough still want to see the Democratic Party as the New Deal Party or the Great Society Party.
Right.
And now we're talking about Green New Deals and whatever. There's always a moment for every, I don't know what it is for the Republican Party. I guess it's Reagan for the Republican Party. They just want to be Reagan again, which is not a...
In retrospect.
But he just and he kept demanding that they remember what they had done, that they were the party that reinvented the American Republic.
Well, isn't that, this brings us to a different aspect of your book. You call it a biography of words, or of his language, and point out correctly that he was, a master of autobiography. He wrote a novel, he wrote speeches, he was an editor, and what we have is his words, and in some ways that's the narrative shank of your book is let's read him, let's see his words, and
it's hard not to.
It's great, and the masterpiece of the speaking genre for you and for me, I suppose, is the 1852. What to the American slave is the 4th of July speech, right. And that's the same theme isn't it? That he stayed with the Republican Party saying, go back to where you were.
Yeah, go back to your creeds,
right.
the four
And
first
that's
principles of the Declaration.
And that's what the theme of the 1852 speech is, isn't it? It's a Jeremiad, which means
Yeah. Yeah, it's the greatest
you've
Jeremiad in American
lost
letters.
touch with your origins.
It goes one better than Jonathan Edwards, frankly, although, who knows. If you haven't read the 4th of July speech, you can pull it up on your computer, read it. It's a rhetorical masterpiece, but the context is interesting. It's 1852. Uncle Tom's Cabin has just been published and has taken the world by storm. The Fugitive Slave Act is being resisted all over the North. He himself has participated in several rescues. You know, the politics of slavery and anti-slavery now are just brewing everywhere. The political parties are tearing themselves apart. The Whig Party is almost dead. And he's asked to speak on the 4th of July by his friends in Rochester, in Corinthian Hall, 600 people. And there's a letter where he says that he worked on that speech for 3 weeks, which is probably longer than any other speech. By the way, if you get into Douglas's words and his oratory, he wrote his speeches. This wasn't a man who just walked into halls and blew out the lights, you know, with sermons off the top of his head. All of his major speeches are in text. In fact, several texts in some cases. And after the Civil War, they're in typescript, happily. But the 4th of July speech is like a symphony in 3 movements. At least that's the way I argue it. I know symphonies mostly have 4 movements. I've been told that by musicians. I didn't know that yet. But he starts the speech by saying, oh, the 4th of July is this glorious day. The Founding Fathers were geniuses. He names some of them. Look what they created. He spends about 6 pages just warming up the audience. What a thing you have to celebrate. And then the pronoun you, your, just start raining down like hell. Pardon me, he says. Why have you invited me here to speak on your 4th of July? The 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. And he just tortures them with the you, your. And then the whole middle of the speech for 10 pages becomes this litany of the horror of the slave trade, of the domestic slave trade, of slave auctions, of the terror, of the humiliation of being a slave, vicious violence against slaves. It's like a hailstorm. And then with only a couple pages left, he just pauses after he does this Jonathan Edwards moment, and he says, there's a reptile coiled at your nation's heart. Break away, break away, break away. You know, it's going to eat your heart out. Slavery. And then he pauses. You can almost imagine him pausing at the lectern. And this is with an audience of his friends. And in the last couple pages, he lets him back up. And he says, your creeds are fine. They're not only fine, they are the great Enlightenment creeds. And your republic is still young and malleable. It's still possible for you to save yourselves. But you don't have much time left, which is the classic form of the Jeremiad. He does it all kinds of other times and with the same questions, the same issues. But it's him saying, look, this project, this experiment, this thing called America, it's got the right ideas. The practices are horrible and hypocritical and violating your own ideas. And slavery has to be crushed. And if it's not crushed by your will being changed, it probably will be crushed by far greater violence that we really don't want to see.
Right. And it's why there was a way that he hated colonization that was different from the way the Garrisonians did. It was always, I am an American.
Oh.
I was born here.
Nothing
This
animated
is my country.
him.
He hated the idea that his birthplace was Africa or somewhere outside the States, and he should go back somehow.
No, he not only hated it, it made no sense to him. It made no historical sense to him.
But you see that interesting radical critique coupled with this profound sense of identification.
Yeah.
that makes him so different.
It's why I call him a radical patriot in the end.
Amazing.
But you're right about, and this is important, this idea of colonization, which really meant, racial removal. Old idea, goes back to the teens in the 19th century, and the Republicans revive it again during the Civil War. The Lincoln administration revived it. In fact, if you want to read an outrage letter, I mean, he wrote a lot of these, public outrage letter. It's in late 1862 when the Lincoln administration, through its Secretary of the Interior, Montgomery Blair, tried to recruit Douglas.
Postmaster General.
Sorry?
Postmaster General.
Postmaster General, sorry. See? This guy, not safe here. He knows everything. Postmaster General Montgomery Blair, whose job really it was to kind of manage the right wing of race relations in the Lincoln White House, let's put it that way. Montgomery Blair tried to recruit Douglas to be their colonization czar, in effect, to run the whole system of removal of blacks voluntarily to Caribbean, to Central America, maybe West Africa, wherever possible, possibly as a means of convincing the country that emancipation has to happen. But nevertheless, Douglas told Montgomery Blair in so many amazing ways
That's sarcastic.
What he could do with and where he could put his idea of colonization. But the arguments were, just as you said, our birthright is here. We are believers in the same creeds as you. We deserve the right to vote. We deserve the right to serve in the army. We deserve everything that an American... It was a citizenship argument.
Right.
And earned by the blood of slaves. Right. He always fell back on earned by the history of blacks is written like a trail of blood, earned by the blood of slaves. Right. And the Lincoln White House knew they need not ask him again to be their colonization czar, and he was glad, indeed, that Lincoln dropped it by the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's no longer there in the proclamation.
So I don't know how much more time we have, but okay. So let me ask you a question about David is best known up until this book for an important book he wrote called Race and Reunion, about the so-called era of sectional reconciliation in the late 19th century. And it's sectional reconciliation at a time that Stephen Woodward called the nadir of American race relations. This is the great era of Jim Crow, of disfranchisement, of lynching, right? And Northerners and Southerners are trying to reconcile, get past their past differences. And a big part of that is remembering the history of the Civil War, right? Rewriting the history of the Civil War to erase the issue, the troublesome issue of slavery, I was struck when I was reading your book about the problem all of us who write about Frederick Douglass have, which is we have to deal with the fact that he wrote 3 autobiographies, and we have to rely on them and then get over them, because he's constantly remembering the events of his past. I was curious about the degree to which your expertise in dealing with cultural re-remembering helped you in the process of dealing with autobiographical re-remembering.
I love the question, Jim, but I'm not sure it did help me that much. I mean,
There are 2 different kinds of memory.
2 different kinds of memory, but individual and collective. However, in all the years of working on historical memory, I did come to realize memory is never to be trusted, as we know every day, because I can't remember the name of whatever.
He's doing great work.
I know. Well, actually, I have a T-shirt. He's running in 2020. I have a cap too. Douglas 2020. In case you can buy them online. So anyway, but seriously, this is an extremely important question. First of all, Douglas's autobiographies, all 1,200 pages of them, as a biographer, are both your source and your problem.
Yeah.
They are a source and a subject. Why does he keep writing his own story over and over, and even revises the 3rd one yet a 4th time?
It's like 3.5,
Yeah. And the autobiographies are always there, they're always in the way. You got to get around them, through them, under them, over them. Get out of the way, Frederick. And part of the problem there is, of course, that he wrote almost nothing about the private part of his life, except about his youth, his slave life. That, and it's why the narrative is such a classic and taught all over the world, because that was him trying, as such a young man, to remember a childhood, to recreate a childhood ravaged by slavery. And again, to get to your question, when I was writing the early chapters of the book, which are his slave life, growing up a slave, which are so full of incredible use of metaphor and lyrical, beautiful writing, I, at one point, just went to the library, checked out about 20 books on child psychology and how we remember our youth, and I mean, I don't know how all that stuff helped me. But I read a whole bunch of stuff about how we remember childhood. I think I just got confused. But it did help me to realize, everything about memory is through association. It has a great deal to do with emotion and trauma. And here's where the Dick Preston book is so important. This book called Young Frederick Douglass, done by this amazing, intrepid journalist in 1980 who went into the archives deeply of the Eastern Shore of Maryland and found out all kinds of details about Douglass's autobiographies, only to show that he didn't make much up in terms of names, places, dates, and the basics. Now, he's still a very creative writer, as any good autobiographer is. When he's writing about his youth, he can be very revealing, I think. But when he's writing about his public life, it's a story about an individual hero, me. And only other people who tend to get into that story are those others who support that ascendant story of the hero. Now, that's not surprising, is it? Memoirs are the most manipulative form of writing in some ways. I'm telling you the truth about my life. Now, however, having said that, I think Bondage and Freedom, the second autobiography, that's his masterpiece because it's a much more political autobiography. This is when he's become the political abolitionist by 1855. You can see violence all over that book. Whoa. You can see him putting his politics out there on the line. In fact, I loved the last sentence of that book. I have a t-shirt with this quote on it, too. At the end of my Bondage and Freedom, after 430 pages, he says, as long as heaven allows me to do this work, I will do it with my voice, my pen, and my vote. Now, he'd have never put that word vote in there back in the first autobiography because Garrison wouldn't have allowed him. But he's now the voting abolitionist, so to speak.
Right.
But he is trying to control our
It's the same details.
Story about him.
Yeah, it's the same details because he's right. He gets the details right, but he refashions the narrative within which he. And I think
he changes a lot of things from one autobiography to the next.
You handle that very nicely as you go through.
Covey fight in the narrative is like two pages.
Right.
In Bondage and Freedom, it's 13 pages.
Right. It's a much.
And there are a lot of examples of that, and you have to stop and all through, and you have to become a literary scholar on this.
And that's partly because of one of the lessons of Race and Reunion is that writing history is always a political act.
Yeah.
Right? It's always it's not so much that you shouldn't remember it, you shouldn't take it literally, it's that you should always understand that it's a product of the moment.
Oh yeah.
And that's the way you treat his various autobiographies, the products of the various moments.
And just one other thought. This idea of a biography of a man of words. At one point, I actually wanted to call the book Frederick Douglass, Biography of a Voice. Sounded cool. But my editor Bob Bender, my brilliant editor, rightly said, nope. It's too literary is what he said. But he was right. I didn't need to play that game. But we're here because of Douglas's words, spoken, written. And by the way, he was so proud that he became a writer. The former slave who could write. I mean, it just was the most, and I'm convinced of this. I mean, you spend this much time on somebody, as the Lincoln scholars do, you know, and some things you become convinced of and some things that are always elusive and you never can tell. Douglas was one of those people, like a lot of us, who didn't know exactly what he thought about something until he went to his desk and he wrote it down. Right. And when he was in a crisis, or there's a big event that's just happened, or the Emancipation Proclamation has been signed, or what, you name it, the Kansas Exodus, Reconstruction Acts, whatever the subject, secession, he'd go to his desk, he'd write a new speech or editorial, and he'd take it on the road. And that's how we get these great speeches, which are almost always in response to
the particular
events and crises.
Right. So that,
anyway. Time for questions? Or he's asking some good ones, but.
Can I ask one more? All right, so as many of you may or may not know, one of the greatest historians of the last 50 years, David Bryan Davis, passed away yesterday. And I thought it would be appropriate to ask you a question about this man who overshadows everything I've ever thought about slavery with his great trilogy on the problem of slavery. He said in the last book that he just published a few years ago, The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Emancipation, that the key to abolition in the United States in the 19th century is free blacks. Free blacks are the key. To what extent do you think Frederick Douglass's life affirms that?
Well, he's the most obvious, visible, prominent example of the slave who became free and then became the creature of words, and actually one of the most famous people in the country. Now, how much a symbol, how much a model like this actually affects history is always a guess. But I think David was arguing there that the fact that free black communities developed and grew and made, you know, communities out of themselves, even created schools and against all the odds, and developed this tradition of conventions that they had every year, and developed this. And Douglas is hardly alone. There's a whole generation of
the children of emancipation.
The children of emancipation. But you know, David Davis was my predecessor at Yale. Nobody replaces a David Bryan Davis. For those of you who do not know his work, he wrote this incredible trilogy. Nobody does this anymore. Leon Litwack did it. There was a tradition for a few historians with the amazing ability and confidence to devote their careers to a subject over time. And David wrote this, it's in the tradition of the first volume called The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture. David was an intellectual historian at first, trained at Harvard, a philosophy undergraduate major, the son of a novelist who came to his interest in race and racism in part because he was a 19-year-old GI in Germany when the death camps were opened, and then in the occupation, as he tells the story, and the racism he saw in the American troops. Right. And then with time, he didn't learn anything about slavery in school or in college or in he studied with Perry Miller, if that means anything to anybody, which actually was probably a great influence. But anyway, David got interested in this problem of slavery, and just by reading and reading and reading, discovered the whole world has done this over time.
He met my dissertation advisor.
What's that?
He met my dissertation advisor.
Oh, no kidding. Wow.
That's what he says.
Yeah. Well, you met Kenneth Stamp, that's right. And David always said Kenneth Stamp's book, in some ways, in this massive historiography on slavery we have now, is still the most important single book that was done to shift the way we study this. But David devoted his life to trying to understand why human beings and why societies practice slavery, and then how
They give it up.
the world found ways to destroy it. And one of my own, and I'll stop with this, David just died last night. Last night. Today's Monday, yeah. There's a place in his second volume in the trilogy, it's called Slavery and Human Progress, which is an ironic title. But there's a place in that book where he's analyzing how abolitionism evolved in British thought and culture and so on and so forth. And he actually explains how the idea of empathy got traction by people seeing the truth and reality of the slave trade.
Right.
And I still remember this. I mean, it's like, there's a historian who can explain how empathy came about. I thought, my God, that guy's amazing. But he wrote,
So we should get some questions.
I know, we should get some, I'm
Go
sorry.
on and on about David Brennan. Do you have any questions? We have a few
Talk
minutes
about
for
DVD
questions.
later, so.
Steve?
So, David, as you might imagine, my question would be about Reconstruction.
Sure.
And I wondered if you could say something about Douglass, his perspective on Reconstruction, his attitude to what the freed people
Sure.
were able to accomplish on their own with and without the Republican Party.
Right. Well, basically, Douglass, Steve knows, was, a fairly standard issue Thaddeus Stevens radical Republican, which is not to take anything away from that point of view. Douglass wanted an activist, interventionist approach to Reconstruction. He wanted the Republican Party to make Reconstruction longer, harsher. He wanted some kind of property redistribution. He even had his own plan about that for a little while, although Douglass was not a very advanced economic thinker.
No.
He saw almost all solutions as political. He's a political liberal in that sense.
Individualistic.
Self-reliance. Individualistic natural rights was his approach. He was thrilled by the 13th Amendment, less than thrilled by the 14th, but has to support it. The 14th Amendment is full of compromises, even though we tend to celebrate Section 1 of the 14th today for good reason. He came to support it, though reluctantly. 15th Amendment, same, wished it had been gone much further. Applauded the Reconstruction Acts, but, one way of thinking about Douglass's view of Reconstruction is this. He does a speech called Composite Nation. He first wrote it in 1867. It reads like a very eloquent manifesto of multiculturalism, or a manifesto for a diversity conference on university campuses today. Call it whatever you want. Every other decade or so, we change the name of this thing, which means America as the place that is multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-racial, living under equality before law. It's an amazing speech if you go back to it. It reads like, right now. I can't find any example that he ever gave it again after about 1870 or 71. He gives it on and off for about 3 years, because what it reflected was, this is 1867. This is kind of the peak moment. The radical Republicans have taken control of Reconstruction. They've passed the 14th. They've passed the first Civil Rights Act. They've just passed the Reconstruction Acts. They've put the South under control, and no Confederate states getting back into the Union without this, and that. And Douglass is full of hope. It's visionary hope that America, he says in the speech, is the one country ever given the chance now to actually create this thing, this republic, living under equality before law that would welcome all kinds of human beings. And out of that eventually came his meanderings intellectually with this idea of America becoming just a fusion of races, where race might not matter. What a vision. We're still working on it. And we take big steps backward sometimes. But that's what Reconstruction at that moment could inspire. But, after 1870 into the 70s, he doesn't give that speech anymore. He still demands and wishes and hopes that the Grant administration, well, he applauded Grant going after the Klan, for sure. You bet. But Douglas is messy and complicated here, too, because he became an expansionist. He thought the United States ought to take this new abolitionist ideology and equality before law to the Caribbean. Take it to Santo Domingo, take it to Haiti. These people need that. Well, American expansion is sometimes quite idealistic, at least at first. That's going to get him into a mess when he becomes U.S. ambassador to Haiti in the late 1880s, when his job is to try to buy, beg, or take a coaling station from Haiti, and he learns they're not going to do it. And he gets himself in a total mess of contradictions. But he had great hopes for Reconstruction, which are essentially all but dashed by the mid to late 1870s. And a great way to see the dashing in his own rhetoric is what I think is the second greatest speech of his life. I mean, we could all debate this, but it's the Freedmen's Memorial Address that he gives in 1876, dedicating that statue of Lincoln in Washington, the standing Lincoln with the kneeling slave. Douglas's speech at that dedication is a masterpiece, but it's really a warning to the government that they have to act soon about Reconstruction or it's all going to be lost. And that day, in the front rows, he had an audience of the President of the United States, members of Congress, the President's cabinet, and members of the Supreme Court. And no black American ever addressed that same audience until Barack Obama was inaugurated. Having them all in front of him. And he warned them, you must act on Reconstruction, or the victory in the war.
Okay, we got another question?
Did he say anything about John Brown?
Oh, yes.
Oh, God, did he ever? Yeah. I could live for the slave. John Brown could die for the slave. That's the kinds of things he said about John Brown. I have a long chapter in the book on the relationship between Douglas and John Brown. It covered about a 10-year period, actually 11, 12 years. I have them meeting 11 times. I think they met 11 different times. I'll just put it this way. He was fascinated with John Brown, this radical, theologically driven warrior. Douglas wished for a John Brown. So did a lot of abolitionists who could never be a John Brown. And haven't we sometimes in our own lives wished there was somebody who might do this, but not me. I got a job and mortgage. But as long as John Brown was talking to Douglas about what he at one point called the subterranean passageway, which was supposed to be what I think I called the militarized underground railroad. That phrase may not stick, but John Brown at times was talking about trying to set up a series of forts, a band of scouts that would begin to funnel slaves out of the Upper South into the North, sometimes in some military ways, paramilitary ways. Douglas was interested. It's a measure of his own desperation through the course of the 1850s. A lot of abolitionists, especially black abolitionists, became rather desperate, especially after Dred Scott. The Dred Scott decision, don't forget, said, black people, you have no future in America. You can never be citizens. Leave. Douglas was listening to Brown's schemes and plans until he found out it was going to be an attack on Harper's Ferry, which was the largest federal arsenal in the country. And Douglas realized quickly this is suicide. But still, he raised money for Brown. He met with him at times he probably didn't really want to. And the Brown family, in the long run, came to believe that Douglas betrayed Brown, which is nonsense. But to their dying day, the surviving Brown children, Brown had, 19, 18, 20 children, and those who did survive never stopped blaming Frederick Douglass, because they believed Douglass was going to bring 400 black warriors with him. Douglass didn't have warriors. He had 3 sons, but they weren't going to be that dumb either. But Douglass goes so far as to go all the way down to Pennsylvania and even into Maryland to meet with John Brown in August of 1859, as Douglass tells it, in an old stone quarry for 2 days, where they talked this through. And Brown begged Douglass to join him, thinking Douglass had some paramilitary force somewhere he was going to bring with him. Among the visions John Brown had that didn't make sense. Douglass tried to talk him out of it. Brown said no. Douglass left. About 2.5 months later, Brown attacked Harper's Ferry. Now, I could go on, but they had quite a deep relationship, and there were letters in John Brown's trunk that was discovered in the immediate wake of the raid from Douglass, which made Douglass, by any legal definition, an unindicted co-conspirator, soon to be indicted and hanged. If they could catch him, and they couldn't catch him, he managed to get home to Rochester when news of the raid came. He was in Philadelphia giving a lecture. And you know who saved his life? The telegraph operator in Philadelphia, who was also a photographer, who later became one of Douglass's favorite photographers. He took 7 photos of Douglass, a man named Hurd. Word came through. This is within 48 hours of the raid. Word came through. Arrest Frederick Douglass, who was believed to tell the sheriff to arrest Frederick Douglass, who was believed to be in Philadelphia. And this guy Hurd got a message to Douglass, said, you have 2 or 3 hours to get out of Philadelphia, but after that I have to deliver the message. And Douglass hightailed it up to Hoboken, New York, and then off to Rochester, and then off to Canada.
We're gonna have to stop at this point. But I want to thank David for this engaging conversation on this
That was fun.
this remarkable book. This remarkable book of his is available on sale outside the lobby.